Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our four panelists that we have for today. First, we have Mr. Galen Carey, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the National Association of Evangelicals. We have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who is the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have Ms. Nia Johnson, who's a visiting assistant professor at Duke School of Law. We're really happy to have you guys here with us and looking forward to our conversation today. You know, religious institutions in the United States have been facing an unprecedented level of violent attacks. In fact, it's been estimated that 617 worshipers were killed at houses of worship in the United States between 1999 and 2022. We've seen a number of really deadly attacks, and the anti-Semitic attack from an American history standpoint of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. We've seen a murder that's taken place at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. We're seeing basically Sikh temples that are being attacked, and it looks as though the threat against marginalized faith-based groups and community organizations will not just go away. We're starting to see the FBI, Homeland Security, and the federal government getting involved. But one of the things that we're really starting to see is happening is that the federal government is looking to get more and more funds into the hands of those who are involved in religious organizations to determine how best to protect them. However, we have individuals on the other side of that argument saying, why are we using tax dollars to support activities that are taking place with religious institutions in which we really have no real background or foundation as to what they may really be involved in? You know, Melissa, when we start seeing this happening and then realizing, for example, with the current administration, that we have doubled the amount of money that's gone to houses of worship and we may be looking to double it again, how do we kind of juxtapose this between the separation of church and state, but then in the same breath looking to protect the citizenry of America that seem to be under attack in our churches?
Yeah, Orland. So part of a government's basic responsibility is to keep its citizens free from fear of violent attacks. I think we can all agree on that. But unfortunately, American houses of worship, as you've mentioned, have seen a steady rise in acts of hostility in recent years. And so gathering for religious worship or a religious service is not something that we should do with fear. We should feel comfortable, just as we do in other aspects of our life, being able to worship together as part of a faith community. So you mentioned some statistics at the beginning. You know, we've been documenting these types of attacks. They include everything from vandalism to arson, bomb threats, gun-related incidents, and even more. And I'm pleased to see that the government, the federal government, is responding in lots of different ways. You know, the FEMA grants that you mentioned, for sure, but also the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has various initiatives to keep houses of worship safe. Including they've just recently established a 25-member faith advisory council. And they also have published a really great guide called Mitigating Attacks on Houses of Worship. But the security grants, these are really helpful to houses of worship that are, you know, potentially those that are at high risk for attack. Again, they're nonprofit security grants, so they are not just confined to houses of worship. They provide funding opportunities for, for nonprofits in urban areas, suburban, rural communities, and they include, you know, as we're talking about today, houses of worship, but also religious schools, community centers, and other charity organizations. And all of this to help improve security measures so that the individuals that are there worshiping or studying or whatever the activity can do so feeling safe and secure.
Wow.
You know, Melissa, I think the legal principle here is that the government is responsible to treat religious organizations the same way they treat every other organization. There's a whole string of court cases establishing that fundamental principle. If they didn't, then they would be discriminating against faith groups. And it's not only houses of worship, It's all kinds of charities that faith-based groups start. For example, many National Association of Evangelicals member churches sponsor pregnancy care centers that help women when they're expecting a baby, with diapers, with formula, with medical referrals, all sorts of care and support that a new mom would need. So one of our centers just recently was vandalized. Some people broke in, they broke windows, they damaged things in the center, and then they spray painted all over the window this chilling phrase: "If abortions aren't safe, then neither are you." So that kind of hostility suggests that we're looking not only at property damage here, but threats to human life as well.
You know, Bettina, when we start seeing what's going on with houses of worship, you know, when we start looking to see that Congress and other legislative leaders are realizing they have to come in and do something, you know, as Galen pointed out, if they're not doing things, they're not treating us or treating other religious organizations in the same manner that they be treating other walks of life. But when do you go too far? When do you get to a point where maybe we have gone over the line, or do you ever get over the line when you're really talking about safety and protection?
Well, I think, Orlin, any time that worshippers, no matter what their faith tradition, are facing imminent threat when they're in the pews or when they're in the synagogue or when they're meeting in their temples, you know, this is a fundamental assault on religious liberty. And so, you know, I understand this argument about separation of church and state, and I, you know, sympathize entirely with it in principle, because it's an important part of our legal heritage. But you can take it to ridiculous extremes. And, you know, do we not have, you know, firemen responding to emergencies at churches because, you know, we don't want to get in between church and state.
Sure.
You know, so no, Orlin, I think the short answer is we haven't yet reached the point where this is a problem. I think where we are seeing the bigger problem is this explosion in extremist rhetoric within American society today. I mean, the Anti-Defamation League, it's been tracking anti-Semitism for the past 60 years. 1960s, according to their data, something like 29% of Americans could be considered anti-Semitic. In recent years, that number has actually fallen to 11%. So it's not that the majority of Americans have suddenly become anti-Semitic, and so we're seeing a rise in violence. I think what we need to look at is the fact that extremist views, fringe views, have for some reason been given permission to be seen in the mainstream of American discourse over the past few years. Our politicians, our public figures have not been held to account for the type of rhetoric which is really fueling some of the violent language and actions which we're seeing today and which we're having to deal with. So I think that is a more important issue in this context.
You know, Nia, as you're seeing what's going on, one of the interesting things is that this is not a particular denomination. It looks like it's going across all different denominations. There's no particular racial group or things of that nature. So I think this whole widespread activity has been one that's been, I think, a little surprising to folk.
Well, I think it's important that we remember that, you know, many of the institutions that are being targeted are places where marginalized people gather, right? Like, you know, when we think about the funds that are being allocated for these resources, they tend to be held in the framework of like, oh, is this money going to strictly Christian churches or churches that may, you know, have a political ideology that they're trying to forward and using this as like, you know, a form of, I guess, what we could call maybe some shadow lobbying in a way. But what we're actually seeing here, and I think it's really important to remember, is that, you know, many of the places that are being attacked are where racially and ethnically marginalized people gather, and are also groups of people who the United States has historically had a history of oppressing. And so really, like, you know, we should not be thinking about this fully within the context of like, oh, this is like money that's being allocated to like, you know, like for the sake of the conversation, like, you know, Mother Emanuel AME Church, but also hold that in tandem with the attacks on, you know, Black grocery shoppers that happened a couple years ago, a violent gun action that was happening in a collective space. This is about targeting where marginalized people tend to live. This is also not the first time that we've even seen, you know, incidents in Sikh temples. You have many individuals who practice the Sikh religion who have described, you know, being mistaken, quote unquote, for individuals who practice Islam, right? You know, and were attacked as a mechanism of furthering Islamophobia as well. And so all of these things go hand in hand. And we need to be mindful and remember that, you know, what we're seeing with this type of government allocation of funds is ultimately an extension of trying to protect various groups of people that would be attacked anyway. That's a really, really critical point that should be acknowledged here.
You know, Galen, you have a pretty diverse group that you end up working with there. I have to imagine that even just the training for them to even understand how to even acquire these funds could almost be a full-time job just to make sure that they're getting protected in ways that the government is intended.
Yes, and thankfully FEMA offers quite a bit of technical assistance to groups that would like to apply. It is a fairly complicated application process. It's a competitive process. Not all the institutions that need the help are able to get it at this point. So it's important to have a well-developed proposal, but there's a lot of help available. I think the key thing is the government's role here. They're not promoting a particular religion and not favoring a religion, but neither are they obstructing the free exercise that any person has. So whether you want to go to a church, a mosque, or play golf, the government is helping to keep you safe.
Well, Melissa, it looks like you sit down there in Capitol Hill and see a lot of these activities. I imagine a lot of this really kind of revolves around how aggressive your legislative leaders are in making their community aware of what's going on.
Yeah, and I actually have to give credit to some of our faith advocacy partners. They invited the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is the organization I represent, to join a real diversity of other communities of faith in a letter of Congress. We sent one the year prior, but requesting an increase in investment in these nonprofit security grants for the 2023 fiscal budget. And as you said, we requested quite an increase or a significant increase, unfortunately, because there's a need, right? So the 2022 allotment was $250 million for the grant program. Our request as a faith coalition was to up that number to $360 million. But I also wanted to say I appreciated what Bettina said, or the point that she made as far as like, what is this signaling? Where is this coming from? And the point that Nia made as well, as far as these are not isolated to a particular faith tradition or ethnicity. It's incredibly like to me, that's indicative that we are now becoming a nation where we feel like violence is a mainstream or appropriate response, regardless of our ethnicity, our race, our religion, and these are acts that are targeted against specific religions, but again, a real diversity of faith traditions, and to me, that's the most troubling component of it all. And again, I'm so glad that the federal government recognizes that they do need to engage in making sure that their citizens feel comfortable worshiping as a community, as part of their faith community.
You know, I'm gonna have to let that be the last word on this, but I think you're right on point there, Melissa, that it is the dialogue that we start seeing now in our communities that at one point would be considered vile and out of place, that's just becoming mainstream, and we've got to hope our society takes a step back. You know, this next case I'd like to talk about is regarding the St. Vincent Catholic Charities. And this is an organization that had been in the process of resettling refugee adults and families in the Lansing, Michigan area. You know, St. Vincent has been helping refugees obtain housing, getting them medical care, and finding jobs, and really just doing those things that I think most religions would say, looking out for the least of these. They've been in a situation now where we're starting to see a lot of pushback. You know, the federal government is saying, well, there's certain things we'd like to see you do. There are other groups that are saying that we would like to see you engage a little bit more. They really did a great job of kind of a resettlement site for the LGBTQ refugee population. But despite all of these services that are happening, we still literally have have activities where there are going to be organizations and governments that are pushing back, and organizations that are governments that are saying that these type of services should not take place. You know, Nia, when we take a look at this particular case and we start to see that, you know, lawsuits have to be formed in order to really come to a real conclusion on this, you know, what is the real concern that people are having, especially when you think about activities in Michigan, because that Lansing area has been struggling in so many other areas, and just the refugee situation just seems to be like a piling on a bad set of circumstances.
Well, I think in this situation, it's very interesting because we're not just talking about, one court case here, but we're talking about two and how the community is engaging with two different cases that ultimately kind of show two different ideologies about the organizations that are moving forward. You have one that seems to have like a pro, LGBTQIA sentiment, and you have another one where there is discrimination against, queer families and their pursuit of adoption. And as much as I would love to sit here and talk about, the Black letter law and what have you, I think it's actually really important that we take a moment to acknowledge that maybe, Christianity is reaping what they've sown a little bit here. Yes, you may want to be in the community and doing something wonderful and helping a broad group of people, but we ought not be surprised when there seems to be a confusion about the goals of the institutions, especially churches, because they have historically aligned with marginalizing queer populations. And so for us to sit here now and then say well, this is a separate case and we feel a way, how dare they, hold us in alignment with two different ideologies. We have stood on this for a very long time. And so now if you have, local organizations that are calling us on the carpet and are saying sorry, we are unwilling to work with you. Yes, there is a real concern here about being discriminatory, but in the same breath, we literally are reaping exactly what we've sown and what many people who affiliate themselves with Christianity and other religions have hoped to sow, which is actually isolation. And so, as much as it's unfortunate, I do think that we have to take some moments to reflect here and wonder if we brought this upon ourselves.
So interesting, Nia. I mean, that's a really interesting perspective. I mean, for me, as I looked at the fact pattern of this case, it was an organization that holds certain views, conservative Christian views about human sexuality. They're in the community. They're working with LGBTQ folk, and they're not discriminating. They're helping all comers on an equal basis. So regardless of their beliefs, they are still performing their community work in such a way as to not discriminate. Their funding was endangered not because they were discriminating, but because of another lawsuit which signaled that they held these views about human sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, it boils down to this one question: can the state target an organization because of their religious beliefs? I mean, this organization was doing its thing, which, look, let me say, I mean, it's all very well for people to want to push conservative Christian groups out of the charitable sector, but 40% of the top 100 charities in the US are Christian-based or faith-based. They are taking up the slack which the government just can't bear that burden. I mean, I come from a country with a strong social welfare net. We do not have that here. And so charitable groups are stepping in to fill that gap. But some are now trying to say, yeah, come and do your thing. Do your faith motivated work in the community, but don't hold the religious beliefs that mark you, that identify you as religious. There's a double standard here. And let me go back to the central point. A state can't target an organization because of their beliefs when they are not discriminating in the work they do in the community.
Well, Galen, let me ask you this, though. We look at this as being a set of circumstances where it looks like this organization is actually doing the right thing, not discriminating in any way, and still seems to be getting punished because of their overall underlying beliefs. I mean, it's almost like, trying to even do the right thing, you get pushback on it here.
Yes, the irony, of course, is that it was the government here that was profoundly discriminating against this local organization that was doing such excellent work. That we see that around the country, not everywhere, but in too many places, and it's particularly local officials many times have an axe to grind. And so we see them trying to discriminate against faith-based groups, particularly those holding historic or traditional views on human sexuality and related topics. So I think the key thing here is that the legal principles are pretty clear at the federal level, and that this kind of discrimination is not constitutional. It's not doesn't comport with our civil rights laws, and yet it takes a lot of money. Many times, I don't know about St. Vincent's Catholic Charities, but many of our member groups have to spend a lot of money just defending their basic rights, money that should be going to caring for needy people. But because of the discrimination they face from local officials, they have to spend money on lawyers just to establish the right to do the good work that they've been doing for decades.
It seems like a real illustration of the culture clashes that we continue to see, and at what expense, right? We have this refugee population that's coming to a community, in need of service, in need of support. St. Vincent is the only government designated refugee resettlement program in that area. And again, they're treating the guest and the individuals consistently, appropriately, compassionately. But unfortunately, this particular Board of Commissioners, again, because of a diversity of opinions, a diversity of perspectives, is punishing them or impeding their ability to again follow another one of their biblical commands, which is to care for the orphan, the widow, and the refugee. And I think that as we have to be very careful as a society, as a pluralistic society, to say, okay, you are allowed to believe your faith tenets as long as they align with what we feel comfortable as a society. And so I think I'm seeing this mainly as a culture clash. I think it's unfortunate because again, who's losing here? It's the roughly 100 refugees that are coming to that community every year. And I was happy to see that the district court ruled in favor for St. Vincent back in March 2022.
Nia, you look like you had a thought you wanted to share.
Yeah, I wanted to be clear that, the question of the legal merits in this case and the legal questions here, absolutely, this organization should not be discriminated against. But I think it's very easy, to walk in on a case like this and just to look at the legal merits and say, like, well, we did the good thing today. And so based on those principles, we should absolutely be absolved, especially when you're having these dialogues in the broader cultural sphere, right? Like part of the reason we're talking about this today is because it matters in the culture and not just before the courts. But in the cultural sphere, it is important to acknowledge the complicity of religious spaces in harming the queer community. And so if you have people now who are skeptical of the role that the church has played in many of these things, even if they are doing good work, it is actually quite reasonable for people to be concerned. Now, it shouldn't be executed this way in a legal fashion. I definitely think that the district court was correct in ruling for St. Vincent. But to take that completely outside of context, it invites in a certain removal of the complicity that we have, played as a church. And we ought not be surprised when people are skeptical, even if we are doing the right thing.
Yeah, but Orlin, I think that it's really important to also think that we are talking about a state actor, a government, and a government is charged to be neutral in interacting with its population. So I think that's another point to be made.
No, I think that's a good point. And I think, Galen, one of the things that, we're looking at is that, we have been pushing churches to do the right thing. There were times that Catholic organizations would have walked away completely because of what they may have been required to do. But this is one of those situations where they said, you know what, we're not walking away. We're going to treat everybody we need to treat. And hopefully that will be the case. There's no question churches haven't always played nicely, but this looks like a situation where when they do try to play nicely, maybe we should play nice or the government should play nice as well.
Yes, indeed. And I think to Professor Johnson's point, yes, we can certainly point to examples where faith organizations have not treated people in the LGBT community well. That's certainly the case. But by the same token, the faith communities and in our case, Christian community, has very important teaching about God's design for human flourishing. And so just to maintain and to teach what the Bible says about all of these things is itself an important contribution to our nation. It's a way in which we bless our nation and contribute to its flourishing.
Well, I think the way we look at it, and I'm going to let that be the last word, Galen, is that these are issues that are so complex that we can't quite figure out how to always figure out what side of the fence you need to be on. It's great when you see government organizations wanting to make sure the protections on their and the proper language and things of that nature are in place. But nevertheless, we also want to make sure that we allow groups that are trying to do the right thing, regardless of what their religious beliefs may be, to really be allowed to flourish in some way. Because, you know, one of the things that you say to yourself, well, if they walked away, where would the community be? And it's pretty clear from this case that if the charitable organization did walk away, this community would be in a lot of trouble. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orlin, according to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, 67% of attacks on houses of worship in recent years were motivated by hatred of a particular racial or religious identity. These are specifically targeted attacks.
Wow. Nia, tell me something I don't know.
Yes, so I've recently found out that there was an organization in Greensboro, North Carolina, that managed to close maternal mortality disparities in their state by dealing with structural racism. And so that's a major victory for a small part of our country, and hopefully we can spread it to a larger field.
Wow, great information. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
So if anyone was wondering whether social media is an incubator of extreme rhetoric, did you know that in just a 3-month period last year, Facebook removed something like 11 million pieces of content related to hate speech? And that was just the bits they caught.
Wow. Galen, tell me something I don't know.
40 years ago this year, President Ronald Reagan gave his famous Evil Empire speech to a meeting of the National Association of Evangelicals. In that speech, he held up the threat to human rights and freedom that the Soviet Union presented, but also a vision for a world living in peace and freedom and flourishing for everyone.
Wow, thank you for that information. Listen, it was great having you here and all the topics that we've talked about. I'm looking forward to doing it soon again. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.